The night was quiet when the young pianist sat by the old keyboard, the same one that had been in the corner of the small living room for years. Its keys had faded, and a few of them produced a soft rattling sound whenever they were pressed. But still, this was the place where every dream began. Every fear, too. The light from a small lamp made the room glow in a warm shade, and outside, the distant sounds of passing cars filled the silence every now and then. For as long as they could remember, music had been their way of understanding the world. While other kids spent time running around in open fields or laughing loudly in the streets, this one found comfort in pressing keys and listening to the soft echo that followed. They didn't call themselves talented, and they never let anyone believe they were special. All they knew was that sitting in front of the piano made them feel less alone. Their home was simple, everything arranged carefully to make the small space feel bigger. The piano stood against the wall, next to a shelf holding a few books, some old music sheets, and a jar filled with coins they were saving for something they weren't quite sure of yet. Sometimes, on nights like this, they wondered if they were chasing a dream too big for someone like them. Music lessons had never been easy to afford. Their family worked hard, but life didn't leave much room for extra things like classes or expensive instruments. When they were younger, they would watch videos of famous pianists online, their fingers moving like magic across the keys. They dreamed of playing like that someday, but deep inside, a quiet voice kept whispering that maybe dreams like this weren't made for them. It wasn't that they doubted their love for music. They doubted themselves. They doubted whether they were good enough to play in front of others, or whether people would listen and think, this person has something special. They didn't feel special. They felt small, unsure, and often invisible. One day, while returning home, they saw a bright poster hanging outside the community center. It was colorful and stood out among the old, faded notices around it. The words on the poster read, "Annual Music Showcase, open for all." For a moment, their heart beat faster than usual. A chance to play? A chance to be seen? But then the doubt slipped in quickly. What if I mess up? What if they laugh? What if I freeze on stage? These questions filled their head, the same way they always did whenever an opportunity appeared. They stared at the poster for a long time. Kids walked by, pointing at it excitedly. Some talked about singing, others about playing instruments, but this young pianist quietly stepped aside, pretending not to be interested. That night, however, the thought of the showcase refused to leave their mind. They tried focusing on their music, but their fingers kept trembling with the idea. They imagined standing on a stage with bright lights shining on them, imagined the sound of applause, imagined a moment where they might actually belong somewhere. It felt like a dream, too wonderful and too far away. Still, they couldn't help replaying the image in their mind. The stage, the piano, the audience waiting. Something inside them whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was their moment to try. Not to win, not to be perfect, but just to try. The next morning, they walked to the community center again. The poster was still there, moving gently in the wind. They stood in front of it, taking a deep breath. Their hand moved slowly toward the registration desk inside, but then they stopped. Their heart raced in fear. They took a step back. Maybe another time. They whispered to themselves, but deep down, they already knew there might never be another time. Opportunities didn't come often, and waiting for the perfect moment only meant letting time escape. That evening, as they sat at the piano, they tried playing their favorite piece. The melody was soft at first, slow and full of emotion. As they played, memories drifted in long hours of practice. The first time they managed to play a difficult chord correctly, the nights spent watching videos of musicians they admired. All the moments that made them fall in love with music. Halfway through the piece, their fingers hesitated. They looked up, letting the sound fade. Maybe they were being foolish. Maybe entering the showcase would only bring embarrassment. Maybe people would think they were trying too hard, but then they remembered something. How music had always been a language they understood better than spoken words. When they were sad, they played. When they were uncertain, they played. When they couldn't say what they felt, the piano said it for them, so why shouldn't they let it speak this time too? The decision didn't come all at once. It came slowly, like a soft wave rising over the shore. They placed their hands back on the keyboard and continued playing. The room felt a little brighter. Their heartbeat felt steadier. By the time they played the final note, they knew exactly what they wanted to do. The next day, for the first time, they walked confidently to the community center. Their steps were slow, but they didn't stop this time. They approached the registration table, filled out the form, and handed it over. The person behind the desk smiled warmly and said, "We're happy to have you." Those words felt strange. Happy to have you. They had never thought anyone would be happy to hear them play. Walking home afterward, a mixture of excitement and fear filled their chest. The showcase was still weeks away, but already they felt the pressure. What if they couldn't prepare in time? What if they forgot everything on stage? What if the small voice in their head, the one that always whispered doubts, was right all along? But even with all those worries, something was different. For once, they weren't running from the chance. They had taken a step forward. That night, they placed a blank notebook on the piano. On the first page, they wrote, "Practice plan." They listed the pieces they wanted to work on, the hours they would devote, and the goals they hoped to achieve. The list wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Every day after school or work, they sat at the piano and practiced. Sometimes the notes came out beautifully. Other times, they stumbled and felt frustrated. But each time they made a mistake, they reminded themselves that every pianist in the world had once been a beginner. Their fingers grew more confident. Their posture improved. They began to understand the melody on a deeper level. Each note carried a feeling, a story, a moment from their life. The music slowly became an extension of their heart. But even as they practiced, doubt never fully disappeared. It stayed at the edges, waiting for a chance to come back. And sometimes it did. There were nights when they closed the piano cover and sat in silence, wondering if they were fooling themselves. Nights when they wondered if the world even cared about a dream like theirs. On one such night, they decided to watch recordings of pianists performing on grand stages. They watched how each performer closed their eyes while playing, how their fingers danced with confidence, how the audience listened with awe. They watched quietly, their breathing slow, their mind filled with admiration. A part of them wished they had been born confident, wished they had a natural gift, wished they could walk onto a stage without trembling, but they weren't that kind of person. They were the kind who learned slowly, who felt deeply, who doubted every step, and yet something in them refused to give up. As the clock hit midnight, they found themselves pressing play on another video, then another. They didn't turn away from the screen this time. Instead, they opened their notebook and wrote, "I want to move people with my music someday." The words surprised them. They stared at them for a long moment. They weren't written for anyone else to see. They weren't a promise or a declaration. They were simply a truth that had been buried inside for too long. The next few days passed with quiet determination. They practiced before sunrise on some mornings and late at night on others. The instrument may have been old, but their passion grew stronger. Sound filled the room with emotion, carrying the weight of their hopes and fears. Sometimes, while playing, they imagined how the showcase would feel. They imagined taking a breath before the first note. Imagined feeling the energy of the audience. Imagined losing themselves fully in the melody. The thought scared them, but it also made their heart feel warm. One afternoon, while practicing a soft passage, they suddenly stopped. They looked around the room, taking in everything: the old walls, the dusty bookshelf, the small window letting in light. They realized that this small room had held their dreams for so long, and now, for the first time, those dreams were stepping outside. The days moved slowly, filled with practice, hesitation, progress, and doubt woven together like threads. But something had changed inside them, a tiny spark that refused to fade. The showcase was still ahead. The hard work was still ahead. But they had taken the first step, and for someone like them, it was already a victory. As they closed the piano cover at the end of the night, they whispered softly to themselves, "I hope I can do this. I really hope I can." And deep inside, despite everything, a small, hopeful voice answered back, "You can." The days after registering for the showcase felt heavier than the young pianist expected. Even though they tried to stay calm, a quiet pressure followed them everywhere. It was there when they woke up, when they walked through the neighborhood, when they sat at the piano. The thought of performing in front of people made their chests tighten in a way they weren't used to. But they pushed forward because going back now felt wrong, like giving up on something important. Every day, they returned to the old keyboard, the one that had become their closest companion. The keys were worn, the sound uneven in places, but it was still theirs. They practiced slowly, trying to perfect each part of the piece they had chosen. But the more they practiced, the more they noticed their flaws. Their timing slipped sometimes. Their fingers shook during difficult sections. Their mind wandered too much one evening. After a long session of trying to fix the same mistake, they let their hands fall to their lap. They stared at the keys with frustration building inside them. "Why am I doing this?" they whispered. The room remained silent. They felt small again, like someone pretending to fit into a world they didn't belong to. The next morning, they walked outside to clear their mind. The streets were quiet. A few shopkeepers were opening their stores. Children ran past holding breakfast snacks, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of fresh bread. They headed toward the community center, hoping maybe someone there could tell them more about the showcase. Maybe knowing what to expect would make things easier. Inside the center, several people were talking and preparing for different activities. Dance classes, singing workshops, painting groups. Everything seemed so lively. The pianist felt out of place among so many confident faces. They stood near the door, unsure where to go. That's when someone noticed them. An older person with soft eyes and gentle features approached, carrying a small bag filled with music sheets. "You look lost," the person said with a warm smile. The pianist hesitated but nodded. "Signed up for the music showcase," they said quietly, almost as if admitting a secret. "Oh, that's wonderful," the older person replied. "Are you a pianist?" The young musician nodded again. "I'm trying to prepare. I'm not sure if I'm good enough." The older person didn't laugh or look surprised. Instead, they studied the pianist with kind eyes and asked, "Do you practice often?" "Every day," the pianist answered, "but it feels like I'm not improving fast enough." The older musician chuckled softly. "Everyone feels like that before a performance. Would you mind if I listened to you play sometime?" The pianist blinked in surprise. No one had ever offered such a thing before. I guess that would be okay." "Good," the older person said. "I live just a few streets away. Come by in the afternoon if you have time." They exchanged directions, and the pianist walked home feeling a strange mix of nerves and hope. Someone wanted to hear them play. Someone who seemed experienced. They didn't know if they were ready for that, but they also knew they couldn't let the chance slip away. Later that afternoon, he carried a small bag of sheet music and walked to the older musician's home. It was a simple house with potted plants lining the windowsill. When they knocked, the door opened gently. "Come in," the older musician said warmly. "The piano is in the next room." The pianist stepped inside and followed them. The room held a beautiful upright piano, not new, but well cared for. Its polished surface reflected the soft sunlight coming through the window. Seeing it made the pianist's heart flutter. "Whenever you're ready," the older musician said, taking a seat nearby. The young pianist sat down, adjusting the bench carefully. Their hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. They took a quiet breath and began playing. The first notes came out soft but steady. As they moved through the piece, they became more absorbed in the music. Their fingers stumbled at a few difficult passages, but they continued without stopping. When they finished, the room stayed silent for a moment. The older musician finally spoke. "You have something special? You play with feeling, not just technique. That's rare." The pianist lowered their gaze. "But I make mistakes, and sometimes my hands shake." "That's normal," the older musician said gently. "Technique can be improved. Confidence can be built. What matters most is heart, and you have that." The pianist didn't know how to respond. No one had ever said anything like that to them before. "Would you like some help preparing for the showcase?" the older musician asked. Their breath caught for a moment. You would help me?" Of course, I can guide you if you're willing to work hard. Without thinking twice, the pianist nodded. I am. And so their training began. The next few weeks became a mix of challenging lessons and emotional breakthroughs. Every afternoon, they visited the older musician's home, sometimes staying for hours. They practiced scales, corrected their hand position, worked on breathing, and learned how to express emotion through each note. The older musician didn't push too hard. They corrected mistakes with patience, encouraged every small improvement, and understood that doubt was part of the journey. Some days were good. The pianist played cleanly, felt the music deeply, and left with a sense of accomplishment. But other days were hard. There were moments when they couldn't get a passage right no matter how many times they tried. Times when frustration made their eyes burn with tears. But the older musician always noticed and said, "It's okay. Everyone struggles. What matters is that you keep going." One afternoon, after making the same mistake 3 times in a row, the pianists dropped their hands in defeat. "I can't do this," they whispered. "Yes, you can," the older musician said softly. "You're too focused on being perfect. Music isn't about perfection. It's about connection." "But I'm afraid of failing," the pianist said, their voice small. "We all are," the older musician replied. "But fear shouldn't decide your future." The pianist looked at the piano keys again. They remembered their first practice sessions, the nights spent watching videos, the decision to finally register for the showcase. They had come too far to quit now. They took a slow breath and tried again. This time the notes flowed better. Not perfect, but honest. And for the first time, they felt something shift inside them. Outside of practice, life didn't slow down. They still had daily responsibilities, and sometimes they were too tired to practice. But even then, they pushed themselves to sit at the keyboard, even if only for a few minutes. It wasn't discipline pushing them anymore, it was purpose. Their family noticed the change. They saw how determined the pianist had become. They heard the music filling the house every evening. They didn't always understand the dream, but they respected the effort. As the showcase drew nearer, pressure grew heavier. Some nights, the pianist lay awake, imagining worst-case scenarios. Forgetting the piece. Freezing on stage, playing the wrong notes. The anxiety made their stomach twist. One evening, after another shaky practice session, they sat with the older musician at the small kitchen table. A cup of tea steamed gently between them. "I feel like I'm getting worse," the pianist said quietly. "You're not," the older musician replied. "You're just scared. And that's normal. Fear shows up when we care about something deeply." The pianist looked at their hands. "What if I let everyone down?" "You won't," the older musician said. "And even if you stumble, it doesn't mean you failed. This journey isn't about the audience. It's about you." The pianist listened closely. Those words stayed in their heart long after they left the older musician's home. The next day, they practiced with a different kind of focus. They weren't trying to avoid mistakes. They were trying to feel the music again, really feel it. For the first time in weeks, they played the entire piece without stopping, letting every emotion flow through their fingers. When the final note faded, they felt something they hadn't felt before, a quiet sense of belonging. The older musician clapped softly. "There it is," they said. "That's the version you need to share with the world." The pianist smiled, a small but genuine smile. But doubt still crept in from time to time. The night before their final rehearsal, they sat alone in their room, staring at the piano. The room was dim and quiet, the streets outside calm. They placed their fingers on the keys and played softly. Not for the showcase. Not for the older musician. Not for the audience. They played for themselves. Each note felt like a part of their story, every fear, every dream, every moment of wanting to be better. The music carried everything inside them. When they finished, they let their hands rest. Their eyes were warm with emotion, but their heart felt lighter. Maybe they weren't perfect. Maybe they never would be. But they were trying, and trying mattered. The next afternoon, the older musician watched them arrive with a different kind of energy, calmer, steadier, more grounded. "Are you ready?" they asked. "I think so," the pianist said. They sat at the piano, took a breath, and began playing. Their hands moved with a gentle confidence, their expression natural and sincere. When they finished, the room felt still. "That was beautiful," the older musician said. "If you play like that on stage, you'll move every heart in the room." The pianists lowered their gaze, a soft blush rising. "I hope so." Practice continued, but something had changed. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled them. The music had become their voice, and they trusted it. As the final days before the showcase approached, the pianist found themselves reflecting on everything. The old keyboard at home, the struggles, the emotional training, the kindness of the older musician, the moments of wanting to quit and the courage to continue. They knew the road ahead was still uncertain. The showcase could go well or it could go badly. But for the first time, they understood something important. This journey wasn't about proving anything to the world. It was about proving to themselves that they could take a step forward, even when fear tried to hold them back. One evening, as they closed the week of the showcase, arrived faster than the young pianist expected. Every morning felt heavier with expectation, and every night was filled with long hours of practice. Even though their progress had been steady, the pressure of the approaching performance made everything feel uncertain again. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. Something inside them kept pushing forward, even when fear tried to slow them down. On the first day of the week, they woke up earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, and the sky was a soft shade of blue. They sat at the piano with a cup of warm tea beside them. As they placed their fingers on the keys, they felt a strange mix of calmness and worry. The music they had practiced so many times felt different now, like it carried the weight of everything they had been through. They played softly, letting their hands move without forcing anything. The notes came out smooth at first, but as they reached a difficult section, they paused. Their breath grew uneven. They closed their eyes and tried again, but their hands trembled. What if I forget everything on stage? They thought, what if the lights blind me? What if my mind goes blank? The questions echoed in their mind like distant thunder. They pushed through the rest of the piece, though it wasn't as good as they wanted. When they finished, they rested their hands and looked out the window. Birds perched on the electrical wires outside, chirping softly as if greeting the day with ease. They wished they had that kind of peace. Later that afternoon, they walked to the older musician's home for their lesson. The house felt warm, as always. The potted plants near the window seemed livelier, and the room smelled faintly of freshly brewed tea. "You look tired," the older musician said. Watching them carefully, "I've been practicing a lot," the pianist whispered. "That's good," the older musician replied gently. "But too much practice can cloud your mind. Sit down. Let's start slowly today." The pianist sat at the piano and began warming up. Their fingers were stiff at first, and the older musician noticed. "Relax," they said softly. "Your hands are tense." The pianist exhaled and tried again. This time the notes came out clearer. The older musician nodded, tapping their foot lightly as they listened. After a few minutes, they said, "Your technique has improved, but your mind is heavy. Tell me what's troubling you." The pianist hesitated, staring at the keys. "I'm scared," they admitted. "What if I stand on stage and everything falls apart? What if people think I'm not good enough?" The older musician leaned forward. "Let me tell you something. Everyone, even the most experienced performers, feels fear before stepping onto a stage. Fear doesn't mean you're unprepared. It means you care." The pianist nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "Remember this," the older musician continued. "The audience isn't there to judge you. They're there to listen. They want you to succeed. And the people who matter will hear your heart in the music, not just your notes." Those words settled gently in the pianist's mind. They felt a little lighter. After practice, they drank tea together in the cozy kitchen. The older musician talked about their first performance many years ago, how nervous they were, how they thought they would faint, how their fingers nearly froze when they touched the keys. But once they started playing, something changed. The music took over. You'll find your moment too, the older musician said. You just need to trust yourself. The pianist nodded, grateful for the reassurance. Over the next few days, they continued practicing with renewed energy. They tried to focus less on perfection and more on expressing emotion. They remembered how the older musician often said, "People don't remember every note. They remember how you make them feel." That thought became their guidance. At home, the old keyboard felt different now. Even though some keys rattled and the sound wasn't perfect, it felt comforting. It had been with them through everything, the doubts, the fear, the small victories. They placed their hand gently on the wooden frame as if thanking it silently, as the showcase date approached. The pianists found themselves walking through the neighborhood more often, needing fresh air to calm their mind. They watched children chasing each other, shopkeepers arranging items, neighbors talking outside their doorsteps. Life moved on around them, simple and steady. It made their worries feel slightly smaller. On the evening before the final rehearsal, they sat at the piano after dinner. The house was quiet and a warm breeze came through the open window. They took a slow breath and began playing. This time, they didn't think about the showcase. They didn't think about mistakes. They just played. And the music flowed soft, emotional, and honest. When they finished, they felt a warmth in their chest, like they had found something they didn't know they had been searching for. Maybe confidence wasn't loud or obvious. Maybe it was quiet, like a soft truth waiting to be discovered. The next afternoon was the final rehearsal at the community center. The pianist arrived early, clutching their sheet music tightly. They had never been inside the performance hall before, and when they stepped inside, their breath caught. The hall was bigger than they expected. Rows of chairs stretched across the room, and at the front stood a polished black piano under a gentle spotlight. The space felt grand, important, and slightly intimidating. Other performers were already there, some warming up their voices, others tuning instruments. Everyone seemed so confident. The pianist felt small again. The older musician arrived shortly after. "You're early," they said with a warm smile. "I wanted to see the hall," the pianist replied softly. "It's big, isn't it?" The older musician said, "But don't let the size scare you. Once you start playing, everything else fades away." The pianist nodded, though their heart raced. When it was their turn to rehearse, they walked toward the piano slowly. Each step echoed in the empty hall. Their palms grew sweaty and their chests tightened, but they kept moving. They sat on the bench, placed their fingers on the keys, and closed their eyes for a moment. They remembered their room at home, the old keyboard, the days of practice. The older musician's guidance, then they began. The sound filled the large hall gently at first. Even though their hands shook a little, they didn't stop. The music echoed beautifully, dancing through the room. Each note felt like a piece of their story being shared. When they finished, silence filled the hall for a moment. Then the older musician clapped. A few others clapped too. "You did well," the older musician said. "Very well," the pianist exhaled shakily, relief washing over them. But even with the successful rehearsal, fear returned later that night. They lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The showcase was the next day. Their heart thumped loudly. Their mind replayed every possible mistake. What if tomorrow I can't do it? They wondered, what if everything goes wrong? They turned on their side, hugging their pillow. The room was warm and quiet, but sleep wouldn't come. After a long while, they got up and sat at the piano in the dark. The only light came from a small lamp in the corner. They placed their fingers on the keys and played very softly, barely pressing the notes. The gentle sound relaxed them slowly. Each note felt like a breath calming their anxiety. They didn't play the whole piece, just fragments, the parts that meant the most to them. By the time they stopped, their eyes felt heavy. They rested their head on their arm for a moment, listening to the silence. "Tomorrow. I'll try," they whispered. The next morning was the day of the showcase. The pianist woke early. Sunlight streamed through the window, and the air felt warm. Their stomach twisted with nerves, but they tried to stay calm. They ate a light breakfast, though it was hard to swallow. Their family wished them luck, offering smiles filled with pride and reassurance. They dressed neatly, choosing clothes that made them feel comfortable but presentable. Nothing too fancy, just simple and clean. They looked at themselves in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. They looked older, somehow. Braver, the walk to the community center felt long. Every step was filled with thoughts, fear, excitement, hope, uncertainty. When they arrived, several other performers were already there. Some were stretching their hands. Others were reviewing notes or humming softly to warm up. The older musician approached them with a gentle smile. "You're here," they said. "Yes," the pianist replied softly. "How do you feel?" "Nervous." "That means you're ready." Those words made the pianist smile, even if only a little. They took a seat backstage, waiting for their turn. The sound of other performers drifted through the curtains, some confident, some shaky. Each performance made the pianist's heart beat faster. They held their hands together, trying to steady their breathing. The older musicians stayed near them, offering silent support. Finally, the announcer called their name. Their heart dropped. "It's time," the older musician said softly. The pianist stood up, legs trembling slightly. They walked toward the stage entrance, each step slow and careful. The curtain parted, and the bright lights of the hall washed over them. They walked to the piano, sat down, and took a deep breath. The room was quiet. Every eye was on them. Their hands hovered above the keys. For a moment, doubt rushed into their mind, but then they remembered all the hours spent practicing. The old keyboard at home, the older musician's guidance, the tears, the determination, the small victories. They pressed the first key. The sound filled the hall, and their journey on stage began. The day of the showcase arrived faster than the pianist ever imagined. Morning light came through the window, calm and gentle, but nothing felt calm inside. The pianist woke up with a strange mix of fear and excitement. It felt like something big was waiting ahead, something that could change everything. Even the simple act of brushing their hair or tying their shoes felt heavier than usual. Every thought circled back to one question they couldn't escape. What if I'm not good enough? They tried to eat breakfast, but their hands were trembling so much that the spoon kept tapping the bowl. The sound echoed loud in the quiet kitchen. Their heart was already beating like they were sitting at the piano in front of the audience. They pushed the bowl away and took a deep breath, trying to remind themselves of all the work they had done. Training with the old teacher, hours of practice, nights of struggle, small victories that no one else ever saw. Deep down, a small voice whispered that they were ready. But the louder voice, the one born from doubt, kept pushing back. They looked over at the piano in the corner of the room. It wasn't a fancy instrument. Some keys were slightly chipped, and the wooden surface had scratches from the years of use. But it was the piano that had held their dreams, their sadness, and everything they had poured into music. They walked over, sat down, and gently touched the keys. A soft melody came out, almost like the piano was reminding them of how far they had come. It wasn't a polished sound, but it was real. And sometimes real is enough. After a few quiet moments, they got ready to leave. The retired teacher was waiting outside near the old car. The teacher gave a warm smile, not saying much, but the calm presence was reassuring. The pianist got into the car, holding their bag tightly. The drive to the hall felt longer than usual. Every streetlight, every corner, every tree outside the window seemed to move slower, like time wanted them to face their nerves. The teacher finally spoke, breaking the silence. "You just have to play from your heart. Forget everything else." The pianist nodded, but the words didn't fully sink in. Even so, hearing them helped a little. Like someone had placed a soft blanket over their fear. When they reached the hall, the building felt huge. People were walking in and out, some carrying instruments, others adjusting their clothes, and a few whispering nervously to one another. The pianist felt small in the middle of everything. The teacher placed a gentle hand on their shoulder and guided them inside. The hallway to the backstage area was bright and filled with light, footsteps and distant chatter. Backstage was a world of its own. A few performers were stretching their fingers. Others were pacing back and forth, trying to calm their breathing. Some were talking with their families, trying to keep their minds busy. The pianist stood still, feeling the air thicken around them. It felt like all the sounds, laughter, whispers, footsteps. Distant music were mixing together and floating in circles. A staff member walked over with a clipboard. "You're third," she said gently. The pianist nodded, but their heart almost dropped. Third. That meant there was barely any time left to pull themselves. Together, the teacher guided the pianist to a small corner backstage. "Close your eyes," the teacher said. The pianist obeyed. "Take a slow breath. Slow your thoughts. Remember the piece you chose. Remember why you chose it. It came from your true feelings. If you play with honesty, the audience will feel it." The pianist took a long breath and exhaled, trying to let some of the fear go. It wasn't easy. Fear had been sitting inside them for years, and fear never listens when you tell it to leave. But something inside shifted, even if just a little. The first performer walked on stage. Applause followed. The pianist listened to the music that played, but it sounded far away, like it was coming from another world. The second performer went next. More applause. People whispered in admiration. Then the staff member returned. "You're next," she said with a soft smile. The pianist stood up slowly. Their legs felt unsteady, as if they were walking through water. Every step toward the stage felt heavier. The teacher walked beside them, up to the edge of the curtain. "No matter what happens out there," the teacher said quietly, "I'm proud of you." Those words hit deeper than expected. The pianist nodded, unable to speak. The curtain opened slightly, and the stage lights spilled through the crack like a warm glow. The pianist walked out, feeling the brightness hit their eyes. The hall was filled with people's faces everywhere. Some smiling, some curious, some simply waiting to be entertained. The pianist kept their gaze low and walked toward the piano. The bench felt colder than they imagined. They placed their hands on their knees, trying to steady themselves. A moment passed, then another. For a second, everything went silent inside them. The hall felt too big, the audience too close, the world too loud. A trembling breath escaped their lips. They lifted their hands and touched the keys. The first note came out shaky. Not wrong, but not confident. A small gasp went through the pianist's chest. But instead of stopping, they closed their eyes for just a heartbeat. And in that small heartbeat, they remembered something: the quiet nights at home. The lessons in the dim room with the old teacher. The reason they chose music in the first place. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, but because music made them feel alive. When they opened their eyes again, the hall was still there, but the fear wasn't as sharp. Their fingers moved again, this time a little steadier. The melody began to take shape, gentle at first, then slowly growing in emotion. Each note carried something real: years of insecurity, moments of hope, silent tears, small joys. Everything they had never said in words. The audience leaned in. People began to listen, not just with their ears, but with their hearts. There was something soft and honest in the pianist's playing, something that didn't try to be perfect. It simply existed. As the melody flowed, the pianist's shoulders relaxed. Their breathing found a rhythm. The hall, the lights, the faces, they all faded into the background. It was just them and the piano. Halfway through, their eyes began to blur, not from fear this time, but from emotion. They remembered the night they almost quit, the moment they felt too small, the day they decided to try anyway. Tears collected but didn't fall. They kept playing. Every part of the piece felt like a story being told, not a grand story full of drama, but a quiet one about courage that grows in silence. The notes became softer, then stronger, then soft again. The melody rose gently and fell like a breath. When the final note came, it stayed in the air for a moment, hanging like a fragile moment that didn't want to leave. The pianists let their hands fall to their lap. Silence filled the hall. A full second passed, then another. Then the applause started. Soft at first, then louder, growing until it filled the entire space. The pianist looked up slowly. People were clapping, some standing, some smiling warmly. A few even wiped tears from their eyes. The teacher backstage was smiling with a look that held pride, relief, and something close to tears. The pianist stood up, bowed awkwardly, and walked off the stage with legs that still felt light and shaky. When they reached backstage, the teacher pulled them into a gentle hug. "You did it," the teacher whispered, but the pianist wasn't sure what it meant. They only knew that something inside had shifted again, a quiet change, something warm, something that felt like growth. They didn't know what the future held. They didn't know if there would be more performances or more stages or more applause. But in that moment, walking off the stage with shaky hands and a full heart, they felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. They felt enough. The moment the pianist stepped off the stage, it felt like the world had shifted in some gentle, unseen way. Their heart was still racing from the performance. But now, the fear that had been sitting in their chest all day was replaced with something warm and unfamiliar. It felt like relief mixed with disbelief. The sound of applause still echoed faintly in their head, as if it was following them backstage. They stood there for a moment, trying to catch their breath, not sure what to do next. The backstage lights felt dim and soft compared to the bright stage, and everything around them seemed to move slowly. Performers walked past, some preparing for their turn, others whispering encouragement, but the pianist stayed still, trying to understand what had just happened. The retired teacher approached with a smile that held pride and emotion. There were no fancy words, no big speech, just a quiet hand on the pianist's shoulder. That simple gesture said more than anything else could. It told the pianist that they had done well, that they had grown, that their effort had meant something. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The calm silence between them felt warm, the kind of silence that only comes when two people understand the same feeling without having to explain it. Slowly, the pianist noticed a few people gathering near the edge of the backstage area. They weren't performers. They were audience members who had walked around the hall, hoping to speak to the person who had just played. The pianist's eyes widened slightly. They had never expected anyone to come looking for them. One woman stepped forward first. Her eyes were a little red, like she had been holding back tears. She smiled kindly and said, "Your music touched me." I don't know how to explain it, but it felt honest. The pianist didn't know what to say. Their throat tightened as they tried to respond. They managed a small thank you, though their voice sounded soft and unsure. Another person came next, a man with gentle eyes. "It reminded me of something I'd forgotten," he said quietly. "Something I needed to feel." The pianist felt their chest grow warm in a way they hadn't experienced before. More people stepped forward, each with kind words, some saying the music made them emotional, others saying it felt peaceful, and a few simply thanking the pianist for sharing something real. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. The pianist had always imagined that no one would care about their music, that their feelings would never reach anyone. But here they were. Listening to strangers talk about how deeply they had felt those notes, the teacher watched with a proud smile, keeping a respectful distance. The pianist glanced over at them every few seconds, feeling grateful in a way they couldn't describe. The teacher had believed in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. Without that quiet guidance, this moment might never have happened. Eventually, the crowd thinned out, and only a few performers remained backstage. The pianist finally sat down on a nearby bench, feeling the exhaustion settle into their bones. But it wasn't a heavy exhaustion. It was the kind that comes after doing something meaningful. The teacher sat beside them and asked softly, "How do you feel?" The pianist thought for a moment. They tried to put the feeling into words. "Different," they finally said. "Like something changed." The teacher nodded. It usually does after a moment like that. They sat in silence again, letting the sounds of the hall fade in the background. There were more performances going on, but the pianist no longer felt the pressure of being part of the event. They had done what they came to do. And somehow, that was enough. After some time, the pianist and the teacher walked out of the hall together. The night air was cool and refreshing, carrying the faint scent of trees and distant traffic. The city lights glittered gently, soft reminder that life continued outside the walls of the performance hall as they walked to the car. The pianist couldn't stop thinking about the audience members who had spoken to them. Each kind word played in their mind like a second melody. They had never considered the idea that their music could move someone else, that it could reach into a stranger's heart and stir a forgotten feeling. It was a new kind of realization, one that sat deep inside, steady and warm. During the drive home, the teacher kept the radio off. The silence felt peaceful, like a gentle blanket around them. The pianist looked out the window, watching the streetlights pass by in soft, glowing lines. Their mind replayed the performance, the trembling start, the steady middle, the emotional end. It felt like watching a memory that didn't fully belong to them. When they finally reached home, the teacher parked the car and turned to the pianist. "I hope you know now that you have something special. You don't need perfect technique to touch someone's heart. You just need honesty. And you have that." The pianist swallowed hard, feeling a rush of emotion they tried to hide. "Thank you," they said softly. The teacher smiled. "Rest now. Tomorrow, you can think about the future." The pianist nodded and stepped out of the car. The air was cooler near their home, carrying the quiet sounds of the night. They walked inside, still feeling the warmth of everything that had happened. The house was dim and peaceful. They placed their bag on the table and walked to the corner where the old chipped keyboard sat. It looked the same, as always, lightly worn, slightly uneven, but tonight it felt different. They sat down on the small bench and touched the keys gently, letting a simple melody flow out. It wasn't planned. It wasn't the performance piece. It was just a quiet tune, something soft and personal. As they played, they felt a surprising sense of peace. The kind that settles in after a storm. The kind that whispers, "You did something brave." The melody continued, slow and warm. The pianist closed their eyes. For the first time in a long while, they didn't feel doubt sitting beside them. They didn't feel the weight of insecurity pressing down. What they felt was simple. They felt enough. In the following days, something unexpected happened. A local musician who had watched the performance reached out through the event organizer. They wanted the pianist to play at a small gathering the next month. Nothing big, nothing formal, just a warm gathering where music filled the room. When the pianist heard the news, they didn't know how to react. Part of them felt nervous, but another part felt excited. The teacher smiled when they heard it and encouraged them to take the opportunity. "People saw something in you," the teacher said. "Let them hear more." The pianist accepted slowly, unsure but hopeful. At home, their family looked at them differently now, not with doubt, but with quiet pride. They asked about the performance, about the people who cried, about what the pianist felt on stage. For the first time, the pianist felt truly seen. They continued practicing every day, but now the pressure was gone. They played because they wanted to, because it made them feel alive, because it connected them to something deeper. One evening, they sat alone at the keyboard again, playing softly. The room was quiet and the light was warm. As their fingers moved, they smiled to themselves. They weren't the same person who had once doubted every note, who had almost quit, who had felt too small for the stage. They had found their voice. They didn't know where music would take them in the future. Maybe to bigger stages, maybe not. Maybe to different cities. Or maybe they would stay right where they were, playing in quiet rooms for people who needed to feel something real. But one thing was clear. They now believed that their music had a place in the world and deep in their heart. They finally understood something they had struggled with for years. They were enough.